Welcome to Coffee with TMEs, where I speak to Cisco's technical marketing engineers about the products and features that they're working on. I'm Jeff McLaughlin, Director of Technical Marketing here at Cisco. And today I have with me a repeat customer, Hosuk who we spoke to just a few weeks ago, I think, about Mac randomization and some of the solutions that we have for the problems posed by Mac randomization. And Hosuk had asked to actually come back on Coffee with TMEs and inform us about some new solutions that we have. So we'll do a quick recap of what we talked about last time, but I'll put a link so that you can actually watch that video as well, because we're not going to go through it all. And then we'll talk about some of the newer stuff that's coming out. But before we get started, Hosuk, it is Coffee with TMEs, and I keep forgetting to ask people, you have your coffee with you, right? In fact, you have the identical Yeti, because we both just got this swag from our boss a couple weeks ago, so awesome. We're fueled and ready to go. It is Coffee with TMEs. We're supposed to actually enjoy coffee while we're talking about this stuff. But the important thing is the technical content. So Hosuk, as I try to remember what we talked about, like I said, it was maybe a month ago. The vendors of the mobile device vendors have introduced this new feature where the MAC address on the phone actually changes, right? Or I guess it doesn't have to be a phone. It could be any mobile device, but particularly phones are what we're worried about, right? And so as you connect to a different SSID, the MAC address will be different. And so there'll be a different MAC address per SSID. And there's even a vendor you talked about that would change the MAC address like every single day. So in the past, we thought about MAC address as something that was hard-coded, and you really didn't change it unless maybe you swapped out a NIC card or something. But now we're looking at MAC address as not being as stable and reliable. So I guess first of all, is my memory correct in the description of the problem? Is that the problem? And then maybe you can just kind of recap how the random MAC actually works.
That is correct. So it started with the Windows 10. So they have a feature that's not enabled by default, but you can enable globally to use the random MAC when connecting to the wireless networks. You have a sub option there where you can even change it every time that you connect to a wireless network. So on a given same SSID, every day it's going to generate a new MAC address. The Android 10, 11, and of course the 12 that's coming will also have the random MAC address. And the iOS 14, of course the upcoming 15 will have the random MAC address as well. The commonality in terms of the random MAC though is not really random in terms of the OUI and everything. There is a set rule in place when they're generating the random MAC address. Let me just show you a slide that I was sharing during the previous session. So if you look at this slide, and on the left hand side it's showing how the MAC address is created. And the first 8-bit, the second from the last bit signifies whether this is a globally unique OUI enforced MAC address versus the locally administered MAC address. If it's set to 1, meaning that it's locally administered, that means that this is a random MAC address that's only significant within the local network. And what these vendors are doing is they're using this bit and then just generating any of the random MAC within that frame.
So this is a little bit like the RFC 1918 addresses, right? The idea is that these are private and not globally unique addresses, and there's a bit in the header, or I shouldn't say in the header, but in the first byte that we can use to identify whether or not this is one of these reserved or private addresses. So that's kind of our giveaway, that if we see that bit set, we know that this is probably going to be a random MAC address, and then we can take appropriate action.
Exactly. And if you just convert it into hexadecimal format, it's really easy. Anything that ends with the 26AE on the first 8-bit is random MAC. At least it conforms to that rule. And the problem with this random MAC for our customers is that as they connect to different SSIDs, as these mobile devices connect to different SSIDs, they change their MAC address. So as a customer, they can't give out a proper access for these endpoints if they're using purely the MAC address to identify them. The other part is if they want to provide differentiated service such as QoS, guest access versus employee access, they cannot use these MAC address because they don't know whether this is owned by them or not because it keeps on changing.
Okay, now, again, I don't want to recap the entire previous video. I'll give people a link to watch that. But we had talked about some solutions to this in the previous video. Can you give just a quick 1 minute recap of what we had talked about then, and then we can move into some of the newer features?
Yeah, so the easy ones are, now that we know how to identify the random MAC address, on ICE you can easily craft a policy that says, oh, if you see a random MAC address, assign a different policy, whether it's like redirecting the random MAC users to a different page, saying that instructs the user to disable the random MAC, or it could be just different bandwidth for the user, or it could be different VLANs. There's a lot of things that you can do in terms of policies. But since we can identify, these are some of the things that we can do even before using Identity Services Engine.
And now, was this a specific feature in ICE for MAC random or for random MAC addresses, or was this just the ability that ICE already had to match a MAC address and set policy?
Oh, this is not a specific feature. So even if customer has a older version, let's say 2.4 or even 2.6, they can leverage this random MAC matching policy on ICE to kind of provide a differentiated access. Okay. However, with the 3.1 we just launched, last month, we have a lot more feature. Yes.
Yeah. So now we can address this specifically, right? It's not just a question of features that were already in ICE.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. During the last session, I really wanted to talk about some of the things that we're introducing in terms of random MAC, but given that the 3.1 was not released back then, I couldn't really talk about these details.
Yep. Okay. So we've got a more robust solution now. So the point is, if you're not on 3.1 yet, and there are a lot of customers that are not on 3.1, it's pretty new. There are solutions for you, but as you get ready to migrate to 3.1, we've got something better. So, all right, Hosuk, tell us what that is.
So before we dive into the enhancement, there is a new concept that we have introduced called GUID, Globally Unique ID. Now, this unique ID is something that different entity can generate. For now, we have these MDM and EMM vendors, the mobile device management or enterprise mobile management vendors such as Intune, AirWatch. They can generate these globally unique IDs and embed them into the certificate that will be used for .1x authentication from these mobile devices. And what we can do with those GUID is we can look at it and we can share that GUID with rest of the components or the solutions within the network.
So this GUID would be a unique identifier independent of MAC address. And
that is correct.
And it's the same regardless of what SSID you're connected to. It goes with the device, right?
Exactly, that's the point.
Which is what we were hoping to get out of MAC address before until they randomized it.
Exactly.
Okay.
So when we are creating the GUID for an endpoint, the MDM, EMM can also configure the endpoint for SSID to use that certificate with the GUID. Whether it's like one SSID or two SSID, we can use the same certificate. And in the end, even though the user or device may be moving from one SSID to the other, that GUID will be able to kind of tell us that this is the same endpoint instead of relying on the MAC address.
Okay. And you mentioned that this is assigned by the MDM or EMM. Are there specific vendors that we can do this with? Do they all support it? Like what is the support for this among the different vendors?
So for now, we have like handful of the MDM vendors supporting this. But we have published as part of this effort the API version 3 for the MDM lookup. And we've shared with all the MDM vendors that we have, that's about like 3 dozen MDM vendors. And they're in the process of making their API changes so that we can look up the endpoints using the globally unique ID. Because it's not just that we can use the GUID in the certificate and identify them, but once we find the endpoints connecting with those GUID, we can use that GUID to look up the endpoints to the MDM that's deployed in the cloud or on-prem to find out if the device is compliant. So that's the whole purpose. So we are still working with our vendors, but we have a few that's already using the API version 3 so that they can leverage the GUID value.
Okay. Sounds good. So what happens next after we get the GUID?
The GUID is not only created by the MDM. In fact, ICE itself can also create the GUID. Since ICE is not an MDM vendor, it will create the GUID in case of the BYOD flow. So if you have an endpoint that's doing random MAC and it's going through the ICE BYOD flow, we can also create the GUID within ICE and use that. Now, when I say use that GUID, what it means is that ICE can share that with the wireless controller, and wireless controller can visualize that GUID in the GUI. You can also share that GUID to DNA spaces. So DNA spaces can visualize that on the GUI. And also ICE can share that with the DNA center and the endpoint analytics. So the random MAC is also visible along with the GUID within the DNA center.
Now, you mentioned that either the MDM or ICE could assign this GUID. Well, I mean, that's actually my question. Is it an either or thing, or it's one or the other? If MDM doesn't support it, then ICE does? Or I guess for BYOD, you wouldn't use MDM, right?
That is correct. So in general, the MDM will be used for the devices that enterprise wants to own and manage, whereas the ICE BYOD will be for purely personal devices. So use case is kind of separate. And in the end, when you're configuring the SSID on an endpoint, you can only have one configuration for that SSID, right? So customer will have to decide whether they want to use that MDM for configuration or the ICE BYOD for that SSID configuration.
Okay. That sounds good. So we've got the GUID assigned. So is that just now a question of assigning policy based on that GUID, the same way we would have for the MAC address in the past?
Yes, and there are a few things, right?
Okay.
Aside from visualizing GUID, there are different components like ICE, the wireless controller, has now a setting where we can deny access or change access for any of the random MAC devices. The other part is, once we have the GUID, we can do a lookup on that MDM in EMM and do any of the policy match. So if the MDM enrollment is done for that endpoint, then we can allow that device to be on the network. However, if that device isn't conforming to the policy, such as the pin lock is not enabled, maybe the password is too short, then we can use the GUID to look up the endpoint instead of the MAC address. Because if we rely on MAC address, depending on which part of the network that the endpoint is connecting, we want that MAC address may not be known to the MDM vendor. So that's where the lookup fails, right? Whereas if you rely on the GUID, then that's going to be unique, and the MDM vendor will have that in their database.
I see. Now, a question comes to mind. One of the problems with MAC address and using MAC address as an identifier for security purposes is that we all know, it can be changed, it can be spoofed. But this GUID, at least for the MDM devices, is embedded in a certificate, right? So does that also make it more secure than a MAC address for an identifier?
It certainly does. First of all, when the endpoint is using MAC address only, then that means that it's connecting to a pre-shared key SSID or open SSID, right? But by using certificate, you're using a .1 SSID. So everything is much more secure in terms of the authentication as well as the traffic. But like you said, that certificate is also making it more secure because it can be configured not to be exportable, where that certificate cannot be used by the other devices. And that in itself makes it more secure because we know that certificate is tied to that single device.
Okay, so not only are we solving just a problem, we're also making it more secure in the process. So
exactly,
it sounds better all around. So a question I had, maybe to go back to the visibility thing that you mentioned, and take endpoint analytics, for example. I did a Coffee with TMEs episode with Krishnan on endpoint analytics, and And so this is typically, this is a technology for identifying unknown devices on the network, right? And figuring out who's the hardware manufacturer, what OS is it running, what type of device, et cetera. So where does the visibility come into play for that? That's almost like a profiling technology. Where does this new GUID visibility help with endpoint analytics?
In terms of the profiling and endpoint, the GUID in itself will not help.
Okay.
But at the same time, think about the devices that's using the random MAC. These are devices that they have user behind them, right? And that also means that we can do more fancy things like embedding a certificate onto devices. So in general, profiling isn't really an issue for the based on the random MAC address. However, what we have done in conjunction with the endpoint analytics in terms of visibility is that the endpoint will change its MAC address through the course of like connecting to a network, right? Between the SSIDs and whatever. And the DNA Center Endpoint Analytics will have a section where you can see the GUID for a given endpoint and also corresponding MAC address that's been used by that endpoint. So that you not only have the GUID visibility for a given endpoint, you can also see what were the history of MAC address that endpoint was using to connect to a network.
Okay, so that's the visibility portion of it.
That's right, yes.
I just, it's a side note, and maybe it's the wrong question to ask in this session, but I wonder if it makes it harder to profile or identify devices if they're using a random MAC address, because obviously the OUI is kind of a useful piece of information in identifying what a device is on the network.
Yep, that is very correct. In fact, it's not really related to this, but we, as part of the 3.1, it's more of in the back end, but we have changed some structure of how the profiling policy works. Previously, we have relied on the OUI vendor as one of the factors in determining, whether the device is a Apple device versus, Google device or Samsung device. But we are kind of moving away from it so that we rely on more upper level protocols such as the user agent or DSP request to find out what the device vendor is instead of just purely relying on the OUI. So yes, it does impact and the profiling aspect, but there are changes that we have made to circumvent or overcome that in this case.
Okay. And then spaces, which you mentioned again, what does the visibility bring you in spaces that you didn't have before?
In this case, it's kind of just minimal. It's just going to have a kind of a visibility saying that this is a random MAC address versus a real MAC address of the endpoint. In terms of any enforcement, we're not doing anything from the DNA spaces.
Okay, but that's visibility we didn't have before. We couldn't tell that before this feature.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Along with, of course, aside from that, showing that it's a random MAC, we also visualize the GUID on top of it. So That's the other part. Yep.
Right. All right. Well, it sounds like a much more robust solution than what we had before. Although, again, there are things you can do if you don't have ICE 3.1. Is there anything else, Hosuk, that I missed or that you want to talk about as a part of this solution?
No, not at this moment. But I just want to tell you that this is just a one step forward, right? So there are other things that we are planning on in terms of the GUID and the random MAC, and this is not something that's going to be static. We know that currently for the MAC endpoints that's like in the market, they only change per SSID. But that doesn't mean that they're going to stay that way, right? It may change per session and it may be every day. That may become the norm. And this random MAC solution that we have will be much more important once that happens.
Okay, well, I think that's the fun part of our job is that all these problems get introduced. And as the network, we've got to figure out how to fix them and secure them. But there's always a solution, and we'll have more as they continue to evolve MAC randomization. So thank you, Hosuk. Really appreciate your time today and your follow-up on MAC randomization.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I will see you next time on Coffee with TMEs. Thanks for joining us.